Ethan couldn't shake the sense of calm that came over him as he stood at the entrance of the Cloverstone Hotel. The night was still young, the air cool, and the streets of the small town were silent, almost too silent. The hum of the security system was the only sound that seemed to echo in the vast, empty lobby. The building before him seemed ordinary at first glance, with its grand stone exterior and aged but elegant facade. The Cloverstone had a long history, a history that was felt in every creak of its floorboards and every dust-covered chandelier hanging from the ceiling. Originally built in the 1920s, it had once been the height of luxury. Wealthy tourists flocked to the hotel, reveling in its opulence, enjoying the ballroom dances and dining in the grand dining room. But over the years, the hotel's glitter faded. The Great Depression, followed by years of neglect and lack of maintenance, had turned it from a jewel in the town's crown into a crumbling relic. By the time Ethan had arrived, the hotel was almost a ghost of its former self. Now, under new management, the Cloverstone had been partially renovated. The polished marble floors gleamed again. The grand chandelier was restored to its former brilliance, and fresh paint covered the walls. But no amount of renovation could erase the feeling that lingered. Something ancient, something tied to the building's past, still clung to the air. The town's locals, old-timers who had seen it all, still spoke in hushed tones about the hotel's storied past, of the untold tragedies that had unfolded within its walls. But Ethan wasn't one to buy into old ghost stories. He wasn't the type to believe in the supernatural. His world was one of facts, logic, and concrete evidence, not myths and legends. At 26 years old, Ethan had worked security for several years, but tonight marked his first night shift at the Cloverstone. He had just moved to the small town a week ago, after hearing about the hotel's reopening and the job opportunity from a friend. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady, and the hours were manageable. He'd gotten used to working night shifts in the past, and the idea of working in a hotel seemed like a good fit. Plus, it was only temporary, a stepping stone while he figured out his next move. As he walked through the lobby, his boots clicking softly against the polished floor, he felt the weight of the place press down on him. The towering columns, the grand staircase that led up to the second floor, and the darkened hallways that stretched beyond the front desk all felt somehow imposing, but not in an immediately threatening way. It was a grand building, certainly, but there was something off about it, something that Ethan couldn't quite put his finger on. Tonight, the hotel was nearly empty. Only a few guests had checked in, a couple of weary travelers, a businessman, and an elderly woman who had asked for a room with a view. The hotel wasn't bustling with activity like it had been in its prime. The hustle and bustle of life had long since passed, leaving only the quiet, hollow echoes of a once thriving establishment. Ethan's job was simple: monitor the security cameras, walk the floors every few hours, and ensure nothing was out of place. He wasn't there to interact with guests or to make sure the daycare was up to snuff. Those were tasks for other staff members. His was the quiet, solitary role of watching over the hotel from the shadows, unnoticed by guests and unnoticed by most employees. He had arrived at the hotel for his shift a little after 10 p.m., and as he clocked in, he was given a quick rundown of the basic procedures. Ethan had already done his due diligence. He'd read through the security manual the night before, familiarizing himself with the layout of the hotel, emergency exits, and key contact information. The night manager, A woman named Linda had offered him a brief but friendly greeting. She was a seasoned veteran of night shifts with a sharp eye for detail, but she didn't offer much in terms of advice or warnings about the hotel's more unusual features. Linda handed him a set of keys, pointed him to the security office, and sent him off. That was it. No fanfare, no instructions on how to handle anything out of the ordinary. It was clear that this was just another night at the Cloverstone. As Ethan made his way to the security office, a small, dimly lit room at the far end of the hallway, he noticed the usual hum of the building, the low whir of the air conditioning, the faint clink of metal from the old elevator that still carried guests up and down, and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Everything seemed normal in a way that only a building as old as the Cloverstone could feel. He sat at the security desk, adjusting the monitor in front of him. The cameras were functional, though slightly dated. There were no advanced surveillance systems here, just basic, reliable technology that had been keeping an eye on the hotel for years. Ethan took a deep breath and settled into his chair, ready for a quiet night of watching and waiting. The hotel's main hallway stretched before him, lined with doors leading to guest rooms and service areas. At the end of the hallway stood the grand staircase, leading up to the second floor. The whole place had a strange charm about it, an atmosphere that felt both welcoming and unsettling at the same time. Despite the fresh coat of paint and the modern touches, there was an undeniable sense of history in the air, a history that couldn't be erased by renovations or time. The first few hours of Ethan's shift were uneventful. He monitored the security footage, took occasional walks around the building, and checked the hotel's entrances and exits. The front desk was empty, the guests were quiet, and the sound of his footsteps echoed through the otherwise silent hallways. But then, at around 1:30 a.m., something shifted. It started with a soft scratching noise from somewhere far down the hall. Ethan froze, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. He looked up from the security screen, but the hallway was still empty. He dismissed it quickly, assuming it was the old pipes settling, or perhaps the wind against the windows. He returned to his security monitors, but as the minutes ticked by, the sound started again, this time a bit more pronounced, a thud followed by a soft shuffle. Ethan rubbed his eyes, wondering if he was just tired, but the noises didn't stop. This time they came from the second floor, an area that was supposed to be empty. His curiosity piqued. He grabbed his flashlight and stood up. He made his way to the stairs, walking cautiously. As he reached the landing, he glanced at the security footage, but the cameras weren't showing anything out of the ordinary. There was no one there, yet the sounds persisted. Ethan made his way up the staircase. The faint echo of the old wooden steps seemed to match the rhythm of the sounds coming from the upper floor. The closer he got to the second floor hallway, the more distinct the sound became, until it was clear. Someone was walking through the halls. But when Ethan reached the top of the stairs and shone his flashlight down the hall, there was no one there. Just the faint hum of the building, the flickering lights, and the sense that he was not alone. Ethan was halfway through his shift when he decided to take a walk down the long, dimly lit hallway on the second floor. The echoes of his footsteps were the only sounds that filled the air, and the building seemed unnaturally quiet for a hotel that had recently opened after such a long period of neglect. The faint buzz of the fluorescent lights above was a constant companion, and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors beneath him reminded him that this place was far from modern. As he made his way down the corridor, his thoughts wandered. Despite his earlier unease about the strange noises and flickering lights, he tried to push it all aside. He had worked in security for a few years after all. He had been in far darker, creepier places. This was just another job, right? And the hotel had just been renovated. Everything was fine. That's when he spotted John. The elderly janitor was moving slowly down the hall, pushing a cleaning cart in front of him. John was a fixture at the Cloverstone, a man whose frail health and hunched back had made him seem older than his actual years. His pale, weathered face was constantly set in a neutral expression, though there was a strange glint in his eyes that Ethan couldn't quite place. John had been working at the hotel for as long as anyone could remember. He was one of the last remaining staff from the original days of the hotel, before the renovations began, and he was rumored to have seen everything. "Evening, John," Ethan greeted him, nodding politely as he approached. John stopped and turned toward Ethan, his tired eyes glinting under the dim lights. "Evening, kid," he rasped, his voice hoarse from years of use. "How's the night treating you?" Ethan shrugged. "Same as always, quiet." John's eyes seemed to linger on him for a moment as though sizing him up. Then, with a knowing smile, he leaned a bit closer as though about to share a secret. "You know," John began in a soft voice, "this place ain't what it seems." He paused as if waiting for Ethan to react. When Ethan didn't respond right away, he continued, "Not by a long shot." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean? The renovations, the hotel's looking pretty nice now." John's eyes narrowed slightly, and he gave a slow shake of his head, his gnarled fingers resting on the top of his cart. "Looks can be deceiving, my boy." His voice dropped even lower, barely above a whisper. "You ever feel like something's watching you? Something out of place, like it doesn't belong here?" Ethan wasn't sure how to respond. He had felt uneasy the night before, sure, but it was just nerves. He'd been hearing strange things in the hallways, but he'd chalked it up to the building settling. Old buildings had their quirks. No need to start believing in ghosts. John, however, wasn't finished. He looked down the hallway as if checking to see if anyone was listening. Then he leaned in closer to Ethan, his voice barely audible. "I've worked here longer than you've been alive, kid, and I've seen things that don't fit. I've heard noises at night, voices, footsteps, things that shouldn't be there." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine despite himself. "What kind of noises?" he asked, his tone a little more serious than he intended. John sighed, his eyes distant as he stared at the floor for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with the weight of years of experience. "People who didn't check out, people who came here and never left. There are rumors, you know, about the old guests, the ones who stayed here during the hotel's glory days in the 1920s. Some of them didn't make it out the way they came in. Some of them were taken." Ethan stared at him, unsure whether to take him seriously. It was clear that John was no stranger to these stories, but Ethan wasn't the type to get caught up in tall tales. Ghosts, spirits, they were just stories people told to make life a little more interesting, a little more thrilling. John must have seen the skepticism in Ethan's eyes because he let out a low chuckle. "You'll laugh now, but trust me, this place has more than just the usual kind of history. And those noises you're hearing, they're not just the building settling. It's the past coming back to remind us it's still here." Ethan didn't know how to respond to that. He shifted on his feet, suddenly feeling uncomfortable in the empty hallway. He tried to laugh it off. "Yeah, okay, John, I'm sure it's just the old pipes or something." But John wasn't done. "No, it's more than that. I'm telling you, Ethan, something's still here, and sometimes the past doesn't want to be forgotten." Ethan stood there, unsure of how to respond. He respected John, but the old man had a tendency to embellish things. Old people did that. They got nostalgic and started talking about things that never really happened, mixing memories with stories. It wasn't anything personal. John probably just didn't have much else to do but reminisce about the hotel's past. "I know it sounds crazy," John continued, oblivious to Ethan's thoughts, "but every now and then I'll hear it. A faint knocking on the walls, whispers in the halls, and every time I walk by that old ballroom I feel it, something watching me. Sometimes I swear I see figures in the windows." He paused again, staring at the floor. "That ballroom, it's the one place where I can feel them the most. The spirits of those who died here, and some of them, well, they're not happy." Ethan let out a half chuckle, though it was laced with nervous energy. "I think you've been working here too long, John." John fixed him with a gaze that was too serious for comfort. "You might think that, but you'll see soon enough. The hotel's history, it's not just in the walls, it's alive. And it's not done with us yet." Ethan felt his stomach tighten. The atmosphere in the hallway seemed to shift ever so slightly, the air growing colder, the silence more oppressive. But before he could process his feelings, John gave a slow, knowing nod and turned to leave. "I'll be in the janitor's closet if you need me," he said, his voice suddenly cheery as if the earlier conversation had never happened. Ethan stood there for a long moment, staring down the darkened hallway. A faint whisper seemed to dance through the air, but when he turned to check, no one was there. He rubbed his eyes and shook his head. It was just his imagination, just the wind. He was being paranoid. The building was old, that's all. But something about John's words lingered in his mind. It wasn't the first time he had heard strange things about the hotel's past, but there was something about the way John had spoken, the conviction in his voice, that made Ethan feel as though there was more to the stories than he'd been led to believe. Still, he wasn't about to start believing in ghosts. Not yet. He had a job to do, and he wasn't going to let some old man's stories get to him. But deep down, a small, nagging feeling began to form, one that told him that perhaps John's tales weren't as far-fetched as they seemed. The night had stretched on longer than Ethan expected, the hours crawling by in the usual monotony of a late shift. The old security monitors flickered faintly in front of him, their grainy images casting dull light across the small, cluttered security office. The only sounds were the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the occasional crackle of static from the radio. Everything felt still, as though the hotel was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But as usual, it didn't. Ethan stretched his arms, trying to shake off the fatigue settling in his bones. He glanced at the clock, 1:45 a.m. He had just finished his rounds, checked the security feeds, and given the all-clear to the few scattered guests who had decided to retire early. The lobby was silent, the hallway empty, the ballroom dark and locked. He leaned back in his chair, letting his eyes roam over the screen again. The hotel was calm, too calm. It was then that he saw it. A flicker on the security feed from the second floor, a glitch at first so subtle he almost missed it. A brief flash of something in the hallway, a shadow maybe. It was gone in the blink of an eye, leaving only the static screen. He frowned and adjusted the monitor, rubbing his eyes. Probably just a glitch in the camera, he thought to himself. The systems were old and the wiring was unstable. The renovations had barely touched the security infrastructure, and it was clear that the tech in the building was more than a little outdated. He dismissed it as nothing more than a blip in the system, another quirk of the ancient equipment. He took a deep breath and ran his fingers through his hair, but just as he was about to move on, the flicker appeared again. This time, it was more persistent, a shadowy figure moving in the corridor. For a split second, it walked down the hallway toward the far end, where the abandoned wing of the hotel sat, closed off for renovations. The figure wasn't clear, just a vague outline of movement, but there was no mistaking the way it walked, purposefully, as though it belonged there. His heart skipped a beat. What the hell? Ethan leaned closer to the screen, narrowing his eyes. He fast-forwarded through the footage, but it was gone. The shadowy figure had vanished as quickly as it appeared. There was no one on the feed, no sign of anyone walking down that hallway. Ethan sat back in his chair, running his hands over his face. He let out a long sigh. It was just a glitch. Maybe the camera was malfunctioning, or the image had been distorted by interference. It happened sometimes, especially with older equipment. He had seen this happen before at other jobs, nothing out of the ordinary. Still, a strange unease crawled up his spine, and he couldn't quite shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He had never been one to jump to conclusions, but now, the quiet of the hotel felt different. The shadow had moved so deliberately, as if it were on a mission. He wasn't imagining things, was he? He ran his hand over the mouse and clicked on another camera feed. The lobby, the kitchen, the main hallway, all clear. But the flicker still nagged at the back of his mind. He rubbed his eyes again and stared at the screen, but when nothing showed up, he finally decided to let it go. There was no use in freaking out over nothing. As the clock ticked on, Ethan decided it was time to stretch his legs again. He pulled himself up from the desk and grabbed his flashlight. He wasn't going to let a little glitch get to him. A quick walk through the hotel, check on the few remaining guests, and then back to the security office for the rest of the night. The hallway was still as he walked through it, his boots clicking lightly on the polished floor. The flickering lights overhead created pools of shadow on the walls, making the place feel emptier than it actually was. Ethan passed by the ballroom, which was dark and locked, and then walked toward the back hall. As he approached the abandoned wing, the very place he had seen the flickering figure on the security feed, he felt a chill in the air. It wasn't the typical coolness of the night or the temperature fluctuation he was used to in an old building. This was different, a cold that seemed to come from nowhere, a sudden drop in temperature that prickled the skin. Ethan froze for a moment, scanning the hallway, looking for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just the silence and the cold. Shaking his head, he pressed on, forcing himself to dismiss the discomfort creeping into his mind. Just old pipes, he muttered under his breath, as if that would make it go away. As he continued, the cold only intensified. It was as if the very air around him had frozen, and he felt his breath catch in his throat as the temperature dropped again. He pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders and quickened his pace. Then he heard it, a soft shuffling sound, almost imperceptible at first, like someone dragging their feet along the floor. It was faint, like a whisper on the edge of his hearing, but it was unmistakable. Ethan's heart rate picked up. He paused, listening. The noise continued, a low shuffle like someone walking slowly through the hall just out of sight. He turned and walked cautiously in the direction of the sound. The hallway was long, dimly lit, but empty. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally along the walls, and the sense of isolation grew heavier with each step. Ethan checked the security feed again. The hallway was still clear, but the shuffling noise continued. He walked a little faster now, his flashlight illuminating the path ahead, but when he reached the end of the hall, the sound stopped. He scanned the area. Nothing. No one. He checked every corner, every nook. Still nothing. The hotel was empty. He was the only one here. But the noise, he hadn't imagined that, had he? Ethan stood in the middle of the hallway, the cold still lingering around him. He glanced around, but there were no signs of movement. The hotel was as quiet as it had been before. Probably just the building settling. He muttered to himself, shaking his head. Maybe a breeze from the old windows had caused the sound, or the HVAC system kicking in. There had to be a rational explanation. But as he stood there, his heart still racing, he couldn't shake the lingering feeling that something was off. It was just a feeling, a gut instinct, nothing more. He turned on his heel and walked back toward the security office. Back at the desk, Ethan sat down again, trying to push the incident to the back of his mind. He focused on the screens in front of him, but the quiet hum of the security system seemed somehow louder now, more oppressive. Every flicker on the cameras made his pulse spike. Every creak in the old walls sounded like a warning. He had been here for hours now, but as the night dragged on, the sense of unease only grew. Was it just the isolation, or was there something else lurking in the shadows of the Cloverstone? His eyes kept darting back to the hallway feed, and that abandoned wing. He would check it again later, maybe tomorrow night. But tonight something felt different. The second night shift at the Cloverstone was eerily similar to the first, quiet, monotonous, and long. Ethan had already gone through his rounds, checked the cameras, and made sure everything was secure. The hotel was mostly empty again, just a few scattered guests sleeping peacefully in their rooms. The silence was oppressive, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But as the hours dragged on, Ethan began to notice a subtle change in the atmosphere. The whispers started again. At first, they were faint, almost imperceptible, like the wind carrying distant voices down the long hallway. Ethan tried to ignore them, chalking it up to the usual creaks and groans of an old building. The windows rattled in the cold, and the air conditioning system kicked on and off in a rhythm that sometimes sounded like murmured conversation. It was nothing new, nothing he hadn't heard before in old buildings. But this time the whispers were different. Ethan paused, leaning forward in his chair as he listened more carefully. The soft sound wasn't just background noise anymore, it was distinct. The voices, though muffled, sounded almost human. They were coming from down the hallway. He glanced at the monitor again, the grainy feed showing the dimly lit corridors of the hotel. The hallway was empty. No one was there. He checked the security logs just to be sure. There had been no new arrivals since the guests had checked in earlier that day. The door was locked. The windows were secure. No one had entered the building. Still, the whispers continued, growing louder with every passing minute. At first, Ethan dismissed it as his mind playing tricks on him, maybe due to the long hours. But there was something about the voices that made him stop in his tracks. They weren't random whispers. They were calling out names. His name, Ethan. The voice was soft, almost a murmur, like someone calling out to him from the other end of the hallway. He felt a chill run down his spine, his heart rate quickening. He stared at the monitor, half expecting to see someone materialize out of thin air. But the hallway remained empty, the cameras still clear, the air still. The whispers, however, didn't stop. They grew more distinct. Ethan, Ethan, come here. It wasn't a distant voice anymore. It felt close, like someone was right behind him. Ethan jerked in his seat, his gaze snapping around the security office. There was no one there. The room was empty, just the soft hum of the air conditioning and the faint buzzing of the monitors. He swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. He turned back to the monitor. The hallway was still empty. His breathing quickened, his thoughts racing. What the hell was happening? The whispers didn't stop. They were persistent, and they were coming from the same direction, the far end of the hallway near the abandoned wing of the hotel. Ethan's mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the air conditioning, maybe the pipes again, or even the old ventilation system acting up. He had heard plenty of strange sounds in his time working night shifts, but this was something else. The voices, his name, sounded too real, too personal. He quickly turned his head to the door, listening intently. The hallway outside the office was silent. The sound of his own breathing felt too loud. Then, almost as if on cue, the voice returned. Ethan. It was right behind him. He spun around, his pulse racing. The chair squeaked beneath him, and his flashlight flickered in his hand as he aimed it toward the empty corners of the room. The light caught only the old filing cabinets, the desk cluttered with paperwork, and the blank walls of the small office. Nothing. The cold feeling from last night began to creep in again, but this time it was worse. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the tension in the air. The room felt heavy, as though the very walls were pressing in on him. He stood up, his legs shaky, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed to check the hallway. The security monitor didn't give him the answers he needed. The feed was still clear, but the whispers were louder now. They weren't muffled anymore. They were coming from the far hallway just around the corner. Ethan, come to us. The voice was clearer this time, and it wasn't just a whisper. It was almost like a command. The urge to get up and investigate the source of the sound was overwhelming, but something deep inside Ethan told him to stay put. Every instinct screamed at him to leave the room and forget this whole thing. But his curiosity won out. The strange occurrence was too much to ignore. With a deep breath, Ethan grabbed his flashlight and opened the security office door. The hallway outside was dark, the fluorescent lights flickering above him. The air felt thick and still, almost oppressive. He hesitated before stepping out, glancing at the empty reception desk. The hotel felt wrong. The silence weighed on him. And yet the whispers continued, growing more insistent. Ethan slowly walked down the hallway toward the source of the sound. His footsteps echoed in the otherwise quiet building, reverberating off the walls and filling his ears with the sensation that he wasn't alone. As he reached the corner where the abandoned wing began, he felt it, the sudden drop in temperature, a cold gust of air that swept across his face. He shivered and instinctively pulled his jacket tighter around him. But the whispers were louder now, clearer. Ethan. He stopped dead in his tracks. There in the shadows, just at the edge of the darkened hallway leading into the abandoned wing, was a figure. It was too far to make out the details, but it stood motionless, as if waiting for him. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Was it a person? No, there was something off about it. He couldn't tell what it was, just a shape in the darkness, standing perfectly still. There was no movement, no sound, nothing. He took a hesitant step forward, his breath catching in his throat. The figure didn't move, but the whispers, now unmistakable like a choir, seemed to come from it. Ethan, come to us. The voice was clearer than ever, and this time it was unmistakably human. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to run, to get out of there before it was too late. But for some reason his legs wouldn't move. He stood frozen, unable to take his eyes off the dark shape at the end of the hall. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Then, finally, the figure began to move, stepping forward into the dim light. Its form was human, tall, but somehow distorted, the edges of its figure blurring into the shadows. Ethan couldn't make out its face, but he felt its gaze. The figure's presence seemed to fill the hallway with an oppressive weight. The whispers intensified, growing louder until they were all Ethan could hear. Suddenly, without thinking, Ethan snapped into motion. He turned on his heel, nearly stumbling over his own feet, and ran back toward the security office, his heart hammering in his chest. The whispers followed him, growing louder with every step. He reached the office door and slammed it shut behind him, gasping for breath. His pulse thudded in his ears as he leaned against the door, trying to calm himself. The room felt colder now, too cold. Ethan staggered over to the security monitors, his hands trembling as he checked the hallway feeds. The cameras were still clear. There was nothing there, no figure, no movement, but the whispering that was still there. It was in his head now, and it was still calling his name. Ethan. Ethan pressed his hands to his ears, desperate to drown out the sound, but it only grew louder. He could feel the weight of the presence from the hallway pressing against him, even though the figure was gone. The sense of something unseen, waiting, hung in the air. He wasn't imagining it. This wasn't a prank. The hotel was hiding something, something old, something that wasn't ready to be forgotten. And it was coming for him. Ethan's shift had started like the others, quiet and uneventful, but tonight something felt different. The air in the Cloverstone seemed heavier, and the shadows longer, stretching into corners where they shouldn't be. His mind kept drifting back to the whispers, to the figure he had seen on the security feed last night, and to the unnerving feeling that something, or someone, was waiting for him. But it wasn't until he encountered the locked door that the unsettling reality of the hotel truly began to sink in. It happened during his second round of the night, when the clock on the wall showed 2:30 a.m. Ethan was making his way through the hotel's rear exit area when he noticed something odd. The back exit door, usually left open for emergency use, was shut, and it was locked. He paused, eyeing the door with suspicion. It was supposed to be unlocked at all times for safety reasons, but there it was, the heavy metal door shut tight. Ethan checked the surrounding area, but there was no sign of anyone. No guests, no staff, no one. This door had always been one of the least used exits in the hotel, tucked away in the back corner, behind a service hallway that led to the kitchens. Its key was kept in a locked cabinet near the front desk, where Ethan was certain it had stayed for years. No one else was supposed to have access to it. He approached the door and grabbed the handle, giving it a firm tug. It didn't budge. The cold steel rattled under his grip, and he tried again, more forcefully. The lock was secure. Puzzled, he scanned the area once more. Maybe it was a mistake, maybe someone had locked it by accident. But then again, if someone had locked it, why had they taken the key with them? It wasn't possible. No one else should be near this exit at this time. Ethan felt his heart race, a sense of unease settling in the pit of his stomach. The quiet, monotonous hum of the building's air conditioning was suddenly deafening, the stillness too thick. He walked over to the janitor's closet, hoping to find a spare key, but there was nothing there. The lock was still in place. Suddenly, he had an idea. Without thinking too much, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of tools, a multi-tool that he always carried with him for small emergencies. Ethan crouched down in front of the door, carefully slipping the tool into the lock's mechanism, trying to pry it open. His hands were shaking slightly as he worked. Something felt wrong, as though the door itself was resisting him. The air seemed colder now, though it was hard to tell if it was just the hotel's old HVAC system acting up again or something more. After a few tense moments, there was a soft click. The door unlocked. Ethan stood up quickly, his pulse pounding in his ears. He swung the door open, eager to see what lay beyond. But the moment he stepped into the dark corridor, a chill gripped him, a sensation so deep, so thick, it made his breath catch in his throat. The corridor that stretched before him was completely dark, the only light coming from a flickering bulb at the far end. The air felt stale and thick, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. It smelled of old wood and must, a mix of mold and age. The door had led to a section of the hotel that had been closed off during the renovations. It was a forgotten part of the building, untouched since the previous owners had abandoned it. He stepped inside, his flashlight illuminating the walls. The hallway was narrow, stretching deep into the building. The walls were lined with old doors, some of them partially opened, others completely shut. There were cracks in the plaster, and in the dim light the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally along the walls. It felt like a place that time had forgotten, a part of the hotel that didn't belong in the present. Ethan's stomach churned, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The air was too heavy, the silence too complete. He shined the flashlight on the floor, revealing old, faded carpet that looked as though it hadn't been cleaned in decades. Just an old storage hallway, Ethan muttered to himself, trying to shake the anxiety creeping up on him. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't just old storage. There was something else in the air, something off about the place. He moved further down the corridor, every step echoing in the silence. The soft squeak of his shoes on the worn carpet seemed loud in the stillness. The air felt heavier the farther he walked, as though the building itself were holding its breath, waiting for him to do something, anything. When he reached the far end of the hallway, he noticed a small door at the very back, barely visible in the dark. The wood was cracked and the hinges looked rusted, like the door hadn't been opened in years. Ethan hesitated, his curiosity pulling him forward. Despite the gnawing feeling in his gut, he moved closer, the cold air from the room beyond seeping out from the edges of the door. His breath caught in his chest. It wasn't just cold, it was as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in the span of a few seconds. He reached for the doorknob, his hand trembling. But just as he touched it, a loud bang echoed from behind him. Startled, Ethan spun around, heart leaping into his throat. The door he had just opened, the one he had passed through, slammed shut. His blood ran cold. No one had been there, he had just checked. The hallway was empty. No one else had entered the building. No one had been anywhere near that exit. Ethan rushed back to the door, his hand fumbling to grab the handle. He pulled, but it was locked again. His breath hitched as he realized what had just happened. The door had been unlocked. He had just walked through it. But now it was locked once more, as though it had been shut from the inside. His heart raced as panic started to set in. He tried the handle again, pushing against the door with all his strength. It wouldn't budge. Frantically, he backed away, his chest tightening as he turned and ran back down the hallway. He passed the narrow doors, his flashlight shaking in his hand. He didn't want to be anywhere near this place anymore. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, but before he could reach the end of the hallway, he stopped. The sound. There it was again. The soft whispering, the same muffled voices from last night. He could hear them clearer now, as though they were right behind him. His pulse quickened. The voices were soft at first, but then louder, more distinct. Ethan. It was his name. He froze in place. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and for the first time in a long while he felt truly afraid. The whispers weren't in his head. They were real. They were coming from inside the hotel. Ethan, you should have left. The door at the end of the hallway creaked open on its own, and the cold air pressed down harder, suffocating him. He turned around quickly, but the whispering seemed to come from every direction now, swirling around him, taunting him. Then he heard the loud click of the door locking behind him. Ethan spun around, his breath quick and ragged as he fought to control the rising panic in his chest. The door that had slammed behind him was locked again. The weight of the situation settled in. He was trapped in a part of the hotel that shouldn't even exist anymore. Trapped with whatever was whispering his name in the dark. The following week felt like a blur for Ethan. The routine of the hotel was the same: quiet, uneventful nights, punctuated by his rounds, the constant hum of the air conditioning, and the flicker of the old lights overhead. But something had changed in him. His calm, logical nature had been shaken. He was still the same Ethan, the same young security guard who didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural nonsense. But now he couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking in the shadows of the Cloverstone. It wasn't just the whispers anymore. Now he was seeing things. Shadows darted across the periphery of his vision, figures that appeared and disappeared in the blink of an eye. It started small, almost imperceptible, just the corner of his eye catching a movement here and there. But soon it became more obvious. A figure standing just beyond the doorway, a fleeting shadow moving in a hallway that should have been empty. Every time Ethan turned his head to look, the shadow would vanish, leaving nothing but the quiet hum of the hotel and the ever-constant feeling that he wasn't alone. Ethan kept brushing it off at first. Maybe it was the late hours. Maybe he was tired. Maybe his mind was playing tricks on him. But each time it happened, the unease grew. The shadows weren't just tricks of the light. They felt real. One particularly unnerving night, Ethan was monitoring the cameras as usual. He had just finished his rounds and the hotel was still empty. No new guests checked in and no one had been in the halls for hours. He leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms and stifling a yawn. The security feed showed nothing out of the ordinary. It was quiet, too quiet. That's when he saw it. A shadow moved across one of the third-floor rooms. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The third floor was supposedly vacant, at least according to the guest log. The last check-in had been hours ago and no one had requested to be placed there. He quickly pulled up the camera feed from that floor. A dark figure, or at least the shape of one, lingered by the window for a brief moment before disappearing behind the curtains. His pulse quickened. This was no glitch. He saw it clear as day. The figure had been standing in the room, staring out the window, someone or something. He grabbed his flashlight and rushed to the stairs. The old building creaked under his weight as he rushed up to the third floor, his boots echoing loudly in the silence. As he neared the room where he had seen the figure, his heart began to race. Had someone broken in, or was it something else? He stopped in front of the door, trying to steady his breathing. The faint smell of old wood and mildew greeted him when he opened the door, but the room was empty. No one was there. Ethan stepped inside, his flashlight sweeping the room. The bed was neatly made, the windows shut tight, and the old armchair by the corner of the room remained undisturbed. Everything seemed normal, too normal. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. But as he moved further into the room, he felt it. The air was different. It was cold, almost unbearably so. He hadn't noticed it at first, but now that he was standing there, it felt as though the temperature had dropped several degrees. He shivered involuntarily and looked around the room again. Something was off. There was a faint, almost imperceptible scent in the air, something familiar. A soft floral note, sweet but heavy, lingering in the room. Ethan furrowed his brow trying to place it, and then it hit him. It was perfume, the same scent his grandmother used to wear. The soft, flowery fragrance that filled her house when he was a child. The thought sent a cold shiver down his spine. "What the hell?" he muttered to himself, stepping back toward the door. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. This was too much. The shadow he'd seen earlier, the coldness, the familiar scent, it didn't make sense. The room had been completely empty. No one had been there, and yet the evidence was undeniable. Something had been there. He glanced down at the floor, hoping for something that would explain it all. There were no footprints in the dust, no signs of anyone moving through the room. But the smell, it lingered, stronger now, as though someone had been standing there only moments before. The unease crept back up his spine, and Ethan's stomach twisted in discomfort. He didn't know what to make of it. The logical part of him screamed that this couldn't be real, that it was his mind playing tricks on him, maybe exhaustion finally catching up to him. But deep down in the pit of his stomach, he knew. The sense that something wasn't right here was too real to ignore. He stood there for a long moment, trying to convince himself that it was nothing, just a fluke, an old building playing tricks on his senses. But when he turned to leave, the whisper came again. "Ethan." It was soft, distant, but clear. The voice came from somewhere within the room. It was the same whisper he had heard days ago, his name spoken like a command, like a beckoning. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. His eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of the figure he had seen on the camera. But there was nothing. Nothing but the cold, the faint scent of perfume, and the suffocating silence. He spun on his heel and rushed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. He could feel his heart hammering in his chest, his mind racing, trying to rationalize everything. He glanced up and down the hallway. It was empty, just like it had been moments before. No one else was here. He hurried back to the security office, his footsteps echoing in the silent hallway. As he reached the door and stepped inside, he locked it behind him. His hands were trembling as he grabbed the chair, sinking into it, trying to steady himself. The whisper lingered in his mind, echoing in his ears. "Ethan." But the more he thought about it, the more he realized he wasn't alone. Something was in the hotel with him. Something was watching him. Ethan stared at the monitors in front of him, trying to focus, trying to make sense of it all. He flipped through the cameras, checking each feed. But there was nothing. No sign of anyone. The hotel was still and quiet, just as it had always been. And yet the sense of dread remained. The shadows, the whispers, the coldness, it was all too much. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, trying to calm the rising panic in his chest. He had to stay calm. There had to be an explanation for all of this. But no matter how hard he tried to rationalize it, a part of him knew that the answers he sought would not be so easily found. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen, his mind a whirl of confusion and fear. The once quiet hotel now felt alive, and it wasn't with the sound of guests coming and going. It was something darker, something older. And Ethan was beginning to realize he was no longer just a witness to this hotel's strange happenings. He was a part of it now. Ethan's night had been filled with a creeping sense of dread, the weight of the hotel's ominous atmosphere pressing down on him. After his unsettling experience with the locked door and the whispers, his mind had been racing, unable to rest. But now he sat back in the security office, the quiet hum of the monitors surrounding him. The clock read 3:12 a.m., and Ethan, despite his exhaustion, couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight. He had to review the footage from the night the door had locked by itself. He had kept putting it off, convinced it was nothing more than a glitch in the old security system. But after the events of the past few days, the whispers, the figure he had seen on the camera, and the strange coldness in the hotel, he knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. The footage was his only chance to understand what was really going on. Ethan stared at the small screen in front of him, his fingers hovering over the mouse. The grainy footage of the hallway from the night in question filled the monitor. He started from the beginning, watching carefully, his eyes darting from one corner to the next, expecting to see nothing but the usual eerie stillness of an empty hotel. At first, the footage appeared uneventful. The hallway was empty, just like it should have been at that time of night. The door at the end of the hallway remained in its usual state, unremarkable. Ethan could see himself on the footage, walking down the corridor to check the area, nothing out of the ordinary. The building was silent, and the only movement was the slight flicker of the lights above. But then, just as Ethan was about to fast-forward the footage, something caught his eye. In the corner of the frame near the far end of the hallway, he saw a figure standing just beyond the reach of the light. It was barely visible, shrouded in shadow. At first, Ethan thought it was just another glitch, maybe the result of a bad connection or a reflection from a window. But as he leaned in closer, the figure became clearer. It was a man, tall and slim, dressed in a suit from the 1920s, the kind of attire that was popular when the hotel had first opened. The figure stood still, staring down the hallway, almost as though he were waiting for someone. The man's features were indistinct, blurry around the edges, but there was no mistaking the silhouette of the suit and the tall, lean frame. The shadowy figure was real. It wasn't a glitch. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He didn't recognize the man, but he knew enough about the hotel's history to understand what this could mean. He had heard the stories, the ones John had told him about the guests who vanished without a trace decades ago. One of those guests was a wealthy businessman who had stayed at the Cloverstone during its peak days, only to disappear mysteriously one evening. There had been no signs of a struggle, no clue to where he had gone. His disappearance had remained one of the hotel's greatest mysteries, and now Ethan was seeing what he thought was a ghostly remnant of the past. For a brief moment, Ethan just sat there, staring at the figure. It was as if time had stopped, the weight of the moment sinking in. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, his fingers gripping the edge of his chair. But just as quickly as the figure had appeared, it was gone. The screen flickered for a split second, and the hallway was once again empty. Ethan blinked in disbelief. He rewound the footage, playing it back slowly, but the figure was no longer visible. He froze the frame, his eyes scanning every inch of the hallway. There was nothing there now, not a shadow, not a flicker of movement. It was as if the man had never existed. His pulse raced. What was going on? Was it another glitch? Could the old security system be malfunctioning again? No, the man had been too clear. The figure had been real. Ethan leaned forward in his chair, his hands trembling as he clicked to rewind the footage. He watched it again, frame by frame. There it was, the man, just as he had seen before, standing at the edge of the hallway, his form solid and undeniable. But as he rewound again, the figure disappeared once more. It was as if it had never been there at all. Ethan's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. He had to be seeing things. But every time he rewound the footage, the same thing happened. The figure appeared, then vanished. And each time, Ethan could feel his heart rate quicken, the reality of what he was seeing crashing down on him. He wasn't imagining this. The man in the suit from the 1920 had been standing in the hallway, just as John had described, just as the stories had said. Ethan felt the weight of those stories on his shoulders now, the gravity of the words John had spoken to him echoing in his mind. The man hadn't just appeared on the footage. He was part of the hotel's history. And now, Ethan was being watched. Ethan stopped the footage and sat back in his chair, taking a deep breath. His thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and fear. What did this mean? What was happening to him? He glanced back at the monitor, the empty hallway staring back at him. The figure was gone, but the question lingered. Who was watching him? He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The hotel wasn't just haunted by memories. It was alive with something that refused to be forgotten. The shadows weren't just shadows. They were remnants of the past, reaching out to the present. Ethan sat there, still staring at the screen, feeling like he was being pulled deeper into a mystery he wasn't sure he could escape from. His thoughts were racing, but one thing was clear: he needed answers. And that meant he had to confront what was happening, no matter how terrifying it was. He knew he couldn't do this alone. He had to talk to John. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized how dangerous that might be. John knew things about the Cloverstone, things Ethan wasn't sure he was ready to understand. But there was no turning back now. Ethan grabbed his jacket, his hands still shaking. He knew the hotel held secrets, secrets that were far older than he had ever imagined. And now, those secrets were coming for him. The shadows in the hall weren't just ghosts. They were memories that refused to stay buried. The following night, Ethan found himself in a state of restless agitation. He hadn't been able to sleep, his mind spinning with the images from the security footage and the strange occurrences that had begun to plague the Cloverstone. Every corner of the hotel seemed to harbor something elusive, something he couldn't quite explain. He wasn't sure if he was just losing his grip on reality, or if the hotel itself was truly haunted. But one thing was becoming painfully clear. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Ethan stood at the front desk, staring out into the dim lobby. The weight of the last few days was pressing down on him, and the quiet of the night seemed to amplify his unease. His mind kept replaying the images, the shadowy figure from the camera, the whispering voice that had called his name, and the locked door that had trapped him in a room that shouldn't have been there. Every sound, every flicker of light, now felt like a threat, an omen of something darker and older than anything he could explain. He couldn't shake the feeling that John knew more than he was letting on, that the old janitor's stories weren't just harmless tales meant to pass the time. Ethan had to know the truth. He had to confront John about the stories, the ones about Richard Cloverstone, the missing guests, and the ghosts that still haunted the hotel. It wasn't hard to find John. The old man was always around, his routine as predictable as the dust that collected in the corners of the hotel. Ethan found him in the hallway near the service closet, pushing his cart slowly along the floor, his eyes hidden behind thick glasses. John's face creased into a smile when he saw Ethan approach, but there was something different in his expression tonight, something that made Ethan's heart skip a beat. "Evening, John," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the nervous energy that was creeping up his spine. John nodded, glancing over his shoulder at the long, empty corridor. "Evening, kid. What brings you out here so late?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. He couldn't put it off any longer. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low. "About the hotel, about what you've been saying." John raised an eyebrow, his wrinkled fingers clutching the edge of his card as if he were bracing himself for something. "What's on your mind?" Ethan's gaze flicked down the hallway, ensuring they were alone. "I've been hearing things, strange noises, shadows in the hallways. And I saw someone on the cameras. A man dressed in old-fashioned clothes like from the 1920s. It's like the hotel is alive. And I know you've been working here for a long time, so I figured you'd know what's really going on." John's face softened, the flicker of recognition in his eyes betraying a deep knowledge. He sighed, looking down at the floor before meeting Ethan's gaze. "You saw him, didn't you?" he murmured almost to himself. "Richard Cloverstone, you're not the first to see him." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Richard Cloverstone. The name seemed to echo through his mind, heavy with mystery and an unsettling sense of finality. John had mentioned him before, but now it felt too real, too close. He leaned in, trying to mask his mounting anxiety. Who was he? What happened to him? John paused for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the far end of the hallway, where the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long in the dim light. He finally spoke, his voice a low rasp, as though he were sharing a secret he had kept buried for years. "Richard Cloverstone was a wealthy businessman," John began. "He was the one who built this hotel in the 1920s. He was the talk of the town, charming, successful, with big plans for the Cloverstone. They say the hotel was going to be the jewel of the entire state. He poured everything into it, his money, his dreams, his heart." John paused, his eyes distant as if lost in memories. But something went wrong on the night of the grand opening. There was an accident. No one knows for sure what happened, but some say Richard was haunted by the guests who had come to the opening party. He was supposed to be there, greeting the dignitaries, shaking hands, smiling for the press. But instead, he vanished, without a trace. They found his car in the garage, his coat draped over a chair and the front door unlocked. But Richard, he was gone. Ethan frowned, trying to make sense of it. So he just disappeared, no clues, no evidence. John nodded slowly. "That's right. No one ever saw him again. His body was never found, and the police could never figure it out. Some say he was taken, that he made a deal with dark forces, that the hotel was cursed from the start. Others say he was driven mad by the pressure of his success, driven to disappear, or worse." Ethan swallowed hard, trying to process everything John was telling him. Cursed? Ethan didn't believe in curses, but the more John spoke, the more real everything seemed. The whispers, the shadows, the cold air, it all fit into this twisted history of the hotel. "And you believe this?" Ethan asked, his voice shaky despite his best efforts to sound confident. John met his gaze with a steady, knowing look. "I've seen it, Ethan. I've been working here for decades. People come and go, but the hotel, it remembers. There are things in these walls, things that won't let go. Richard Cloverstone didn't leave this place. His spirit is still here, wandering the halls looking for something, redemption maybe, or maybe he's still running from whatever it was that made him vanish in the first place." Ethan shook his head, a sharp laugh escaping his lips, though it lacked any humor. "This is insane. Spirits, ghosts, that's just old man talk." John's expression didn't change. "You'll see. Everyone who works here long enough does. The ghosts, the spirits, they're not just stories. They're real and they're tied to this place. I've seen things, kid, things that don't make sense, and I'm telling you, you've seen them too, you've heard them." Ethan's stomach twisted as he tried to shake off the feeling of being drawn into something he couldn't control. "You think this place is haunted, that's what you're saying." John looked at him, his face as serious as Ethan had ever seen it. "Not just haunted, Ethan. Unresolved. The spirits here are lost, trapped in the memories of the hotel. They can't move on, and neither can Richard. He's still looking for something, maybe forgiveness, maybe an answer. But whatever it is, he's here, and he's not the only one." Ethan's mind was spinning, the weight of John's words settling heavily on his chest. He didn't want to believe it. He couldn't believe it. But the shadows he had seen in the hallway, the figure in the room, the whispers, they all pointed back to the same thing. The hotel wasn't just a building. It was something else, something alive with memories of the past. "And you think I'll just accept that?" Ethan asked, his voice growing tight with frustration. John's eyes softened and he reached out, resting a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You don't have to believe me, but it's not about belief. It's about feeling it. The hotel has a life of its own, and once you've been here long enough, you'll know, and you'll never forget." Ethan took a step back, his mind racing. There was no denying that something was wrong, but could he truly believe it? Was he really ready to accept that the stories he had always dismissed as nonsense were, in fact, real? "I don't know, John," he said quietly. "I don't know if I can believe this." John gave him a long, steady look. "You don't have to believe it right now, but the hotel will show you. It always does. Just wait, you'll see for yourself." Ethan stood in silence for a moment, the weight of John's words hanging in the air. The hotel, with all its history and darkness, seemed to be closing in on him. The whispers, the shadows, the locked doors. He had only just begun to scratch the surface of something much bigger, something much more terrifying. And he was beginning to realize he wasn't ready for it. Ethan had grown accustomed to the quiet and eerie atmosphere of the Cloverstone, but tonight felt different. The air was thick with anticipation, and the shadows seemed to cling to the walls like a secret waiting to be revealed. The building, with its dimly lit hallways and old wooden floors, was beginning to feel like something more than just a place of work. It felt like a living entity, one that was watching him, guiding him deeper into its twisted heart. And Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer just a bystander in this strange unfolding. He was part of it now. He had been working the night shift again, walking his usual rounds. The upper floors were silent, the kind of quiet that felt almost suffocating. The hotel was practically empty, just a handful of guests scattered across the upper floors, but none of them had come out in hours. Ethan had grown used to the feeling of being alone in the building. He had grown used to the strange creaks and groans of the ancient structure, the hum of the air conditioning system, and the occasional flicker of lights overhead. But tonight, the quiet was unsettling. Every corner felt like it was hiding something, and the more Ethan walked the hallways, the more he began to feel like he wasn't alone. The presence of the building, its history, and the ghosts that John had mentioned earlier seemed to hang in the air. As Ethan made his way down the hall, his flashlight beam sweeping over the faded carpet and dust-covered furniture, he suddenly felt it, a shift in the atmosphere. The temperature dropped slightly, a cold chill creeping up his spine. He paused for a moment, scanning the hallway ahead of him. It was too quiet, too still, and the darkness felt more oppressive than usual. That's when he saw it. At the far end of the hallway, standing in the dim light near the old fire exit, was the figure. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the familiar sight of the man in the vintage suit. The same man he had seen in the camera footage. The same figure that had appeared, then disappeared like a ghost from the past. Ethan stood frozen in place for a moment, the beam of his flashlight trembling in his hand. The figure, tall and slender, was dressed in a perfectly tailored 1920s suit, the fabric dark and slightly shiny, the cut of the jacket old-fashioned yet impeccable. The man's features were still indistinct, blurry around the edges, as if the figure were fading into the shadows. But Ethan didn't need to see the details clearly to know that this was the same figure. It was real, not a trick of the light, not a glitch in the camera. For a moment, Ethan's mind raced. What was going on? How could this be happening? Was it possible that the stories John had told him weren't just stories after all? Was this the spirit of Richard Cloverstone, the man who had mysteriously vanished decades ago? His instincts screamed at him to turn around, to leave the hotel and never come back. But instead, something else pushed him forward, a strange determination, as if he needed to confront whatever this was, to face it head on. Maybe he was finally ready to understand the truth. Maybe he could make sense of everything that had been happening in the hotel. Without thinking twice, Ethan began to walk toward the figure. Each step was slow, deliberate, as though the air itself was pushing against him. The hotel's silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of his shoes against the old carpet. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the figure at the end of it still standing motionless. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing with questions. Why was this happening? Who was that man? And most importantly, what did he want? As he approached, the figure didn't move. It simply stood there, waiting, as though it knew what was about to happen. Ethan paused for a second, his flashlight shining directly on the figure, but it didn't react. No movement, no sign of life. It was as though the man wasn't a person at all, but something trapped between worlds, something that existed in a place where time and reality didn't matter. When Ethan was just a few steps away, the figure suddenly turned its head and began to walk slowly down the hallway. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. The figure was moving now, not toward him, but into the farthest part of the hotel, the locked wing. The locked wing. The one that had been shut off since the renovations began. The one no one had access to. The wing that had been abandoned for years, its doors and windows boarded up, its hallways gathering dust. The one place in the hotel where no one was supposed to go. Ethan's pulse raced as the figure continued to walk toward the entrance to the locked wing, its movements slow and deliberate. Ethan didn't even have to think about it. His feet were already moving, following the figure, the compulsion to see where it was going overriding everything else. He didn't care about the dangers anymore. The fear that had been gnawing at him for weeks now pushed him forward. He had to know what was inside that wing. He moved faster, his steps echoing down the hallway. The figure was still ahead of him, walking just out of reach, but always leading him toward the locked door. As he neared the entrance, he could feel the temperature drop further. The air was thick now, and he could almost taste the dust and mold that seemed to rise from the closed-off wing. A sense of foreboding filled his chest, but it only drove him onward. He reached the door, old, rusted, and sealed tight. The heavy metal handle was cold beneath his fingers as he tried to pull it open. The figure was still ahead of him, turning to face the dark hallway inside, beckoning him to follow. And he did. Ethan shoved the door open with all his strength, the old hinges groaning in protest. The dark corridor stretched before him, lit only by the flickering light from his flashlight. The air was stale and a strange scent lingered, something old, something forgotten. He took a step into the hallway, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There were no more whispers now, no more shadows darting at the edge of his vision. Everything was silent and still. But the figure, the man in the 1920s suit, was gone. He had vanished again. Ethan felt a chill creep up his spine, and he turned in circles, searching the dark hallway for any sign of the figure, but there was nothing. Just the dead silence of the hotel's forgotten wing. He was alone. His mind raced. What was happening? Where had the man gone? Was it all just a figment of his imagination? Had his mind finally cracked from the pressure of this haunted place? Or had he really just seen something impossible? Ethan took another step forward, his flashlight flickering as it illuminated the faded wallpaper, the broken furniture, and the empty rooms. There was something here, something the hotel had hidden away, something that wanted to remain locked up in the past. But Ethan wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet. He had to know. The hallway inside the locked wing felt like a time capsule, a forgotten space that the world had left behind. The walls, lined with peeling wallpaper, seemed to be closing in on Ethan, the air heavy with the scent of age and decay. His footsteps echoed in the silence, the only sound in a corridor that had been untouched for years. The flashlight in his hand cast long shadows, flickering as the beam danced over the dilapidated furniture and broken doors. Ethan had come this far, following the figure, driven by an unrelenting need to understand what was hidden in this part of the hotel. The rest of the building was just a shell, filled with empty rooms and vacant hallways, but this wing was different. It was as though the hotel itself was holding its breath, afraid to reveal the secrets it kept locked away for so long. He stopped in front of a door at the end of the hallway. It was an old guest room, the nameplate on the door worn, barely legible. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he read the faded name. Richard Cloverstone. Richard Cloverstone. The very name that had haunted the stories, the one John had spoken of, the original owner of the hotel, the man who had disappeared without a trace all those years ago. Ethan's heart raced as he slowly pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The room inside was as still as the rest of the hotel, but there was something unnerving about it. It was frozen in time, frozen in the past, like it had been sealed off by the hands of fate itself. Ethan stepped into the room, and as his flashlight swept across the furniture, his first thought was how it seemed to be exactly the same as it had been in the 1920s. The decor was old-fashioned, dark wood furniture with intricate carvings, a bed covered in faded, flower-patterned linens, and heavy velvet curtains drawn tightly across the windows. Even the dust on the furniture was thick and settled in a way that spoke of years of neglect, but there was something strange about it. The dust was fresh, like someone had been here recently, just within the last few days, but had vanished without a trace. Ethan's fingers brushed against the dresser, and the old wood felt smooth beneath his touch. He moved toward the bed, feeling a sense of unease wash over him. It was as though the room had been waiting for him, waiting for someone to find it. His pulse quickened as he moved around the room, scanning every corner for anything out of place. And then something caught his eye. A small nameplate on the dresser, tarnished and old, caught his flashlight's glow. The name engraved on it stopped him cold. Richard Cloverstone. It wasn't just the name on the plate, it was the strange sense of familiarity, the way everything in this room felt too personal, too connected to the mystery of the hotel. Ethan knew without a doubt that this was Richard's room, the man who had once owned the hotel, the one whose ghost had been haunting the halls. Suddenly, something shifted in Ethan. It was as if the room itself had changed in his eyes. The air felt heavier, the room colder. He couldn't explain why, but it felt like the walls were closing in on him, as though the room itself was alive, waiting for him to discover something hidden deep within its confines. He moved toward the bed, his breath shallow, his mind racing. There, tucked beneath the mattress, was something unexpected. He reached down and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. The cover was worn, the edges frayed, and it was thick with age. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he flipped open the journal, the pages creaking with the weight of years gone by. The handwriting inside was neat, meticulous, each entry carefully penned in faded ink. The first entry was dated from the opening night of the hotel, back in the 1920s. May 13, 1922. The night is finally here. The Cloverstone is open and the crowd has arrived. It's everything I've dreamed of. The grand ballroom, the finest dining, the sparkling chandeliers, it's all come to life. But something is different tonight. There is an unease in the air, a strange feeling I can't shake. I have invited the guests here to celebrate my success, but I feel their eyes upon me. Their smiles seem too wide, too knowing. I wonder if they are here for the opening of the hotel, or if they are here for something else, something darker. Ethan's eyes widened as he read the words, his fingers itching to turn the page. He felt a cold shiver run down his spine as the journal continued to unfold Richard's story. May 14, 1922. The night has taken an unexpected turn. The guests are not what they seem. The spirits of the hotel, they have revealed themselves to me. I can see them now, moving through the hallways, watching me. It's as though they never left. And I have made a terrible mistake. There are things here that are not meant to be. I've made a pact with the spirits, a deal to ensure my success, but the price is high. The price may be my soul. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He turned the pages frantically, desperate to understand. The entries became more frantic, more filled with guilt, as Richard wrote about his dealings with the spirits, about the pact he had made and the tragedy that had occurred on the opening night. Ethan read about the guests who had vanished, the lives lost, and the curse that had followed Richard ever since. May 20, 1922. It is too late. The spirits are here and I cannot escape them. They demand more than I can give. I have tried to break the pact, but it is impossible. The hotel is a prison, a place where the spirits are trapped, bound by my actions. And now they will claim me. I hear them in the hallways, their whispers getting louder. I hear their voices in my mind calling me to join them. I cannot stay here any longer. I must leave before they take me, before the curse consumes me. Ethan stopped reading, his mind reeling. The words on the page were clear now, the truth that Richard had hidden in the hotel's walls. Richard had made a deal with the spirits to guarantee the success of the hotel, but that pact had gone terribly wrong. The spirits had taken the guests, and now they were after him too. He flipped through the pages, his hands trembling with the weight of the discovery. The final pages were filled with cryptic symbols, ramblings about forgiveness, redemption, and the sacrifice Richard had made to free the spirits trapped within the walls of the Cloverstone. But the last entry was the most chilling. May 25, 1922. I have seen them, the guests. They are here and they are not gone. They want something from me, and I know I can't escape. They have come to take me, to claim the deal I made. I fear the worst, and worse still, I fear what will happen to the hotel if I am gone. The curse will never end, and neither will I. The spirits will stay here and they will wait for the next one to come, and I will be one of them. Ethan sat back, the journal still in his hands. His heart was pounding in his chest, and he felt a weight in the pit of his stomach. The truth had been right there, hidden in plain sight. The Cloverstone wasn't just a hotel. It was a prison, a place cursed by Richard's deal with the spirits. And now, it seemed, Ethan had become a part of that curse. As he sat in the dusty room, the room that had once belonged to Richard Cloverstone, the weight of the man's guilt hung heavy in the air. Ethan understood now why the hotel felt so alive, why the whispers filled the hallways and shadows moved on their own. Richard had never left. His spirit, like the others, was trapped in this place, wandering the halls, seeking redemption for a deal he couldn't undo. Ethan placed the journal back under the mattress, his mind spinning. The question now wasn't whether or not the hotel was haunted. It was how long he had left before the spirits of the Cloverstone came for him, just as they had for Richard. The hotel had always been a place of secrets, but now it felt like something far more sinister. As he left the room, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a pact of his own with the spirits that still roamed the halls. And he was beginning to understand the price. Ethan's hands trembled as he held Richard Cloverstone's journal in his lap, the weight of the discovery pressing heavily on his chest. The room around him seemed to grow colder with every page he turned. It was as though the very air had shifted, thickening with an unnatural chill. He tried to focus on the words, but the whispers, the same whispers that had been haunting him since the night he entered the hotel, seemed to grow louder, filling his ears with an urgency he couldn't ignore. He flipped to the next page, his breath shallow as the words blurred in front of him. Richard's cryptic entries were becoming more erratic, more frantic, as if the man had been losing his grip on reality long before his final, mysterious disappearance. The deeper Ethan went into the journal, the more he began to feel a presence in the room, something tangible like a weight pressing down on his shoulders. June 1, 1922. I hear them now, not just in my mind but in the hotel. Their footsteps echo down the hallways, their voices murmur just beyond my door. They are closer than they've ever been. I've tried everything, locked the doors, sealed the windows, but they are relentless. The hotel won't let me leave. It wants something from me. It needs me to stay to fulfill the bargain I made with the spirits. But the cost is too high. I fear I've already lost everything. Ethan's stomach tightened as he read the words. The intensity of Richard's panic was palpable, but it wasn't just the words that were getting to him. It was the way the room felt, alive somehow, like it was pulsing with an energy he couldn't explain. The air grew heavier, thicker, as though the room itself were responding to Richard's words. The flickering light overhead made it difficult to see clearly, and the shadows seemed to move unnaturally along the walls. Suddenly, the lights flickered once more and the room went dark for a split second, plunging Ethan into an abyss of blackness. His heart skipped a beat, his breath catching in his throat as he scrambled for his flashlight. He turned it on, casting a shaky beam of light across the room, but as the light flickered back to life, the temperature plummeted. A cold, biting air rushed past him, seeping through the cracks in the walls and filling the room. It was as if the very atmosphere had frozen, and Ethan's breath came out in white puffs like it was winter. His fingers numbed as he clutched the journal tighter, his pulse quickening. The whispers, though, hadn't stopped. They were no longer just a distant hum in the back of his mind. Now they were clear, too clear, as if they were speaking directly to him. The voices came from all directions, their tones low and urgent. Leave now. The room seemed to shudder as the whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a storm. Ethan tried to shut them out, but the voices were everywhere, clawing at the edges of his consciousness. He clenched his teeth, trying to force the fear back down, but it gnawed at him, relentless and suffocating. "Leave now, Ethan." He stood up abruptly, his heart racing, and scanned the room. The shadows were longer now, stretching across the floor like fingers reaching out for him. He turned to face the corner where the light from his flashlight didn't reach, but something moved in the dark. A shape, a figure, standing at the edge of his vision. His breath caught in his throat. The figure, the same figure he had seen before, the one dressed in the vintage suit, now standing right behind him, just out of his direct line of sight. Ethan whipped around, his flashlight darting toward the shape. But when he turned, the room was empty. The figure was gone. Ethan's pulse hammered in his chest as he scanned the room once more. There was no one there, no sign of movement, just the eerie shadows and the heavy silence. But the air felt wrong, thick, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in around him. The whispers started again, louder this time, swirling around him like a chorus of voices, each one telling him to leave, to get out, to run. His heart was racing now, each beat echoing in his ears as the room seemed to grow smaller, more claustrophobic with every passing second. "Leave. Leave now." The voices were more urgent, more insistent, like 1,000 souls crying out at once, and Ethan felt the weight of their pleas pressing down on him. He staggered backward, his hand reaching for the door, but the handle wouldn't budge. The door was locked. Panic surged through him. He tried again, pulling at the handle with all his might, but it wouldn't give. The room was closing in, the air thick and heavy with an unrelenting pressure. The whispers were almost deafening now, the voices blending together into a cacophony of sound. "Leave. Now." They were practically screaming at him. Ethan's breath was ragged as he pulled away from the door, his mind reeling. The journal in his hand felt impossibly heavy now, its pages practically vibrating with the energy in the room. He looked down at it, seeing Richard Cloverstone's frantic words, his guilt, his fear. The hotel wasn't just a building, it was a trap, and Ethan was caught in it. Suddenly, he felt a presence behind him. Without thinking, he spun around. The figure was there again, right behind him. It wasn't just standing there this time. The man in the 1920s suit was moving, slowly, deliberately toward him. Ethan could see the faint outline of the figure in the dim light, its face still hidden in shadow, its presence cold and suffocating. The room seemed to contract around him, the walls pressing in as the figure advanced. Ethan took a step back, his pulse racing, his mind screaming at him to run. But his legs felt like lead, frozen in place by the overwhelming sense of dread that filled the room. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "He's here. He's come for you." Ethan couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The figure's presence was so overwhelming, so suffocating, that he felt as though he was suffocating in the very air. As the figure took another step forward, Ethan felt a sudden coldness, like ice settling over his skin. He gasped for air, but the temperature had dropped so suddenly that it felt as though the very life was being drained from him. The air felt thick, like it was pressing against his chest. The figure reached out a hand, his fingers stretched toward Ethan as if beckoning him. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, and for the first time he understood what Richard had written in the journal. The spirits were real, and they were here in the hotel, waiting for something or someone. "No." Ethan managed to choke out the word, his voice barely a whisper. But the figure's hand came closer, and the whispers surged, louder now than ever before. Leave, leave, leave. Ethan's hand shot out, desperately grabbing for the door again, but his fingers brushed against nothing. The figure was too close now. He could feel its presence, the chill of its touch just beyond his reach. The room felt like it was closing in on him. The walls seemed to pulse, like the hotel itself was alive, breathing with a life of its own. In that instant, the figure vanished, gone like it had never been there at all. The room was still again, the oppressive air lifting, leaving behind nothing but silence. But Ethan knew it wasn't over. The shadows were still there, lurking in the corners of his vision. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were just waiting, as if they were preparing for something. The past had come alive, and it wasn't ready to let him go. Ethan stood there, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. His mind was spinning, the fear still heavy in his chest. But as he glanced back at the journal in his hand, he understood one thing. Richard Cloverstone's pact wasn't just a story. It was alive. And Ethan was now caught in the same curse. Ethan couldn't sleep that night. He lay awake in his small, dimly lit room, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him. The figure, the whispers, the cold, everything had become a blur of confusion and fear. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that the hotel wasn't just haunted. It was alive with something ancient, something that had been waiting for someone like him to uncover its secrets. The deeper he dug, the closer he came to the truth, and the more it pulled him into its grasp. The hotel was alive, not in the sense of a living organism, but alive with the restless spirits of its past. Ethan had seen them, felt them, trapped in the very walls that had once been the scene of Richard Cloverstone's ambition and the suffering of those who had stayed there. He could no longer deny it. The hotel wasn't just an old, decaying building. It was a prison, a place where spirits were bound by unfinished business, where the dead could never rest. Ethan had to find answers. The first light of dawn had barely touched the sky when he arrived at the janitor's closet. The hotel was quiet, too quiet for his liking, the silence echoing in his ears as he knocked on the door. His heart pounded as he waited. John had been the one person who had spoken about the hotel's dark past, about the spirits that lingered, and Ethan couldn't ignore it anymore. He had to know what he was up against. He had to confront the truth. John opened the door slowly, squinting in the dim light as he saw Ethan standing there, his face pale and drawn. The old man's eyes flicked to Ethan's hands, clutching the journal, the pages now slightly dog-eared, and then met his gaze. For a moment, the two of them stood in silence, as if measuring each other up. "You look like you've seen a ghost," John finally said, his voice gruff but filled with a strange understanding. "I have," Ethan replied, his words barely a whisper. "I need to know more about Richard, about what happened here." John's expression didn't change, but the shadows in his eyes deepened. "You're digging into things that have been buried for decades, kid. You're asking questions that, well, there's a price to be paid for that." "I don't care," Ethan said, his voice firm, though his hands were trembling. "I need to know what's going on in this hotel. I need to understand why it feels like something's watching me. Why I keep seeing the figure in the suit. Why the whispers won't stop." John stepped aside, gesturing for Ethan to come in. The janitor's closet was cramped and dim, but it smelled of old wood and much like the hotel itself. The walls were lined with cleaning supplies, and there were old mops and brooms leaning against the corner. John closed the door behind them, his eyes studying Ethan closely. "You're in over your head," he said quietly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Richard Cloverstone wasn't just a businessman. He was a man who dabbled in things most people can't even begin to understand. Dark things, things that should have stayed buried. Ethan's stomach churned at the words. What kind of things? What do you mean? John turned away, staring at the floor for a long moment as if gathering his thoughts. Richard had a dream, Ethan, a dream of power. He built this hotel to be the grandest thing in the state, a monument to his wealth and success. But that wasn't enough for him. No, he wanted more. He wanted immortality. He wanted to control death itself. Ethan swallowed hard, trying to process the weight of John's words. What do you mean? How could he control death? John finally turned back to face Ethan, his eyes heavy with regret. He made a pact. He turned to the occult, seeking the guidance of spirits, dark forces that promised him eternal power, the kind of power that would make him untouchable. He was greedy, Ethan. That's what destroyed him. And the spirits, those he made the pact with, they trapped him just like they trapped all the others. Ethan felt his legs weaken as the weight of John's words crashed down on him. The room seemed to close in around him, the air thick with something oppressive, suffocating. So he really did make a deal with spirits? Ethan asked, his voice trembling. John nodded slowly. Yes, and it wasn't just Richard. The hotel's guests, the ones who vanished, became part of that deal. They weren't supposed to stay here. They were supposed to move on, but Richard's greed kept them trapped. The pact was never meant to be kept. No one could live forever, but Richard wanted to. And when the deal went wrong, when everything started to crumble, the spirits got angry, very angry. Ethan took a step back, the room suddenly spinning as the implications of John's words began to settle in. Wait, so the spirits are trapped. That's why they are still here. And the figure I saw, the one in the suit, it's Richard. John sighed, his face tightening with the weight of the truth. Yes, Richard's spirit never left Ethan, and the spirits of those who stayed at the hotel, they are still here too, unresolved. They can't move on until they've been avenged, until the pact is broken. But Richard, he's the one who holds them here. He's the one who caused all of this. The curse of the Cloverstone is tied to him. Ethan's mind reeled as he processed this new reality. The hotel wasn't just haunted by random spirits. It was anchored to Richard Cloverstone's greed and unfinished business. Ethan had always dismissed the idea of ghosts, of curses, of anything beyond logic. But now, it felt like his skepticism was unraveling, thread by thread. He had walked into the hotel a skeptic, but the events of the past week had pushed him into something far darker, a world where logic no longer held sway, where he was now part of a story far older and far more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. Then what do I do? Ethan asked, his voice small, the fear creeping into his words despite his best efforts to remain composed. How do I get out of this? How do I stop this hotel from taking me too? John gave him a long, steady look. The spirits are restless, Ethan. They won't rest until they are avenged. And Richard, he's the key. You need to find out what happened to him. You need to break the curse before it's too late. Ethan swallowed hard, his thoughts spiraling. He could feel the weight of John's words, the burden of the hotel's history pressing down on him. He was no longer just a witness to the supernatural events in the Cloverstone. He was entangled in them. He looked at John, seeing the sadness in his eyes. How do I break the curse? How do I even begin to understand what Richard's pact was? John's voice dropped to a near whisper, as if he feared the walls themselves might hear. You need to find Richard's heart. It's buried somewhere in the hotel, hidden deep in the walls, locked away in the hotel's foundation. Once you do, you'll have the power to break the pact. But be warned, the spirits won't let you do it easily. They'll fight you every step of the way. Ethan's mind raced. Richard's heart, hidden in the hotel. How was he supposed to find something so buried, so lost? But he knew, deep in his gut, that there was no turning back now. The hotel had claimed him, just as it had claimed everyone who had come before him. And if he didn't act, if he didn't finish what Richard started, then he would be another lost soul trapped in the hotel's endless nightmare. Ethan clenched his fists, determination flooding his veins. He wasn't just going to run. He was going to end this. And he was going to do whatever it took to free himself from the curse of the Cloverstone. Ethan's last night's shift at the Cloverstone was not like any other. The usual sense of dread he'd been carrying with him for weeks had transformed into something far more palpable, something he could feel in every fiber of his being. The air in the hotel felt thick, suffocating, as though the building itself was closing in on him. The whispers had long since turned into full-fledged entities, shadows and figures that were no longer confined to the corners of his mind or the edges of his vision. They were here with him, and for the first time, Ethan was truly terrified. The cold had returned with a vengeance, seeping through the walls and flooring like an intruder. The flickering lights overhead cast long, distorted shadows that stretched across the empty hallways. Ethan couldn't escape the feeling that the hotel was alive, aware of his every move. As he walked through the hallways on his last shift, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up, his pulse pounding in his chest. Each step felt heavier than the last, and his flashlight seemed dimmer, as if the light itself was fighting to stay alive in the oppressive darkness. Ethan had seen the spirits before, the faint whispers on the security footage, the figure in the 1920s suit, the shadowy forms darting through the halls. But tonight it was different. Tonight, the spirits were no longer hidden behind veils of shadow or unseen whispers. They were visible. They were real. He was making his usual rounds when he first saw them, a pair of figures standing in the far corner of the hallway. Their faces were indistinct, blurs of pale skin and shadow, but their eyes were clear, empty, hollow, staring directly at him. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. The figures didn't move, they just watched him, their presence suffocating the space around him. Ethan's heart raced as he took a tentative step backward, his mind desperately trying to rationalize what he was seeing. The spirits were real and they were aware of him. "Help us." The voice was soft, but it seemed to come from all directions. Ethan flinched, the sound echoing in his ears. The figures didn't speak again, they just stood there, waiting for him to make his move. The air around them grew colder, the temperature dropping sharply, and Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of loss, a void so deep it threatened to swallow him whole. Ethan blinked, and when he opened his eyes, the figures were gone. The hallway was silent again, save for the soft hum of the hotel's ancient air system. His pulse was still racing, his breath shallow, and he could feel the cold lingering on his skin. He couldn't deny it any longer. The spirits were here, and they weren't just haunting the hotel. They were trapped in it, waiting for something or someone. Ethan pressed on, his mind spinning. The hotel's history, Richard Cloverstone's journal, John's warnings, all of it was starting to fall into place. He couldn't ignore the truth anymore. The spirits had been trapped here, bound to the hotel by Richard's dark pact, and now they were seeking redemption. He found himself drawn to the abandoned wing once again, the place where the spirits had first revealed themselves. The air was thick with dread as he stepped into the darkness, his flashlight cutting a narrow path through the oppressive gloom. The temperature dropped with every step he took, and the shadows seemed to stretch and writhe around him, like the very walls were alive with memories. Ethan's thoughts raced as he walked deeper into the wing, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The whispers were louder now, swirling around him, beckoning him forward. Ethan. The voice was unmistakable. It was Richard Cloverstone. Ethan froze. He turned toward the sound of the voice, but there was no one there. The shadows in the hallway shifted, and for a brief moment the figure of Richard Cloverstone appeared in front of him, standing tall and imposing in the same vintage suit he had seen on the security footage. His face was pale, his eyes dark and hollow, and his presence was as suffocating as the hotel itself. "I made a terrible mistake, Ethan." Richard's voice was low, a tortured whisper that seemed to echo through the very walls of the hotel. "I thought I could control it. I thought I could cheat death, but I was wrong." Ethan's heart thudded in his chest as he stood there, unable to move. The man, the ghost, was right in front of him. He had no face, just a hollow figure, a remnant of the past, a soul cursed to wander the halls of the Cloverstone forever. "You were chosen, Ethan." Richard's voice was filled with regret and sorrow. "Chosen to end this, to break the curse." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. "What do you mean? What curse? What did you do?" Richard's figure flickered, and his eyes seemed to darken with the weight of the truth. "The land. The land this hotel was built on. Cursed. I thought I could control it, but I couldn't. The spirits, they were already here, and by making the deal I bound them to the hotel, trapped them in this place forever. The pact was supposed to give me power, eternal life, but instead it has enslaved us all." Ethan's stomach churned. The realization hit him hard. The hotel wasn't just haunted, it was built on cursed land, a land tainted by something older and far darker than anything Ethan had ever imagined. Richard hadn't just made a deal with spirits, he had tied their souls to the hotel, binding them to the land with his greed. "I didn't know, Ethan." Richard's voice wavered with the weight of his guilt. "I didn't know it would come to this. I thought I was doing the right thing, but now we're all cursed, and so are you." The weight of Richard's words crushed Ethan. He was no longer just a witness, he was part of it. The spirits were not just trapped, they were waiting for someone to free them, to end the curse, and Ethan was the one who had been drawn into it. Ethan stepped forward, his mind a swirl of confusion and fear. "What do I do? How do I fix this?" Richard's form flickered again, and his eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed to transcend time. "You have to make the choice, Ethan." The words were heavy with finality. "You must break the curse, or it will never end." Ethan felt a coldness wash over him, a feeling of being trapped in a world he couldn't escape. The weight of the spirits' gaze, their sorrow, their need for release, hung over him like a shroud. He had always been skeptical, always dismissed the supernatural as a figment of the imagination, a trick of the mind. But now, standing in front of Richard Cloverstone's spirit, he knew that this was no longer just a matter of belief. This was real, and it was happening to him. He had to make a choice. Would he free the spirits, break the curse, and risk everything? Or would he turn away and leave them to suffer for eternity? The decision was his. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, becoming a chorus of voices, swirling around him, pleading for release. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing long and oppressive. The hotel was alive, and it wanted him to make a choice. He could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him, the spirit's expectations settling on his shoulders. And as Ethan stood there, the figure of Richard Cloverstone fading into the darkness, he realized that the curse wasn't just tied to the hotel. It was tied to him, too. Whether he liked it or not, he was part of the hotel's past now. He could run, but the spirits wouldn't let him go. The hotel wouldn't let him go. He stepped forward, feeling the weight of his decision bearing down on him. It was time to confront the spirits and free them, or face the consequences. The hotel's silence was deafening as Ethan made his way down the darkened hallway toward the abandoned wing. The weight of the past few days had settled heavily on his shoulders. The whispers, the figures in the halls, and the haunting presence of Richard Cloverstone's ghost had all led him to this moment. The moment when he could no longer pretend that this was just a bad dream. The hotel, with its dark secrets and restless spirits, was alive with history, and now it was demanding something from him. The air was thick with anticipation, the shadows seeming to stretch longer as he walked. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the hotel itself was dragging him toward the inevitable. He had always prided himself on being a logical man, a skeptic who could explain away the strange, the unexplainable. But now, after everything he had witnessed, Ethan knew there were things in this world that could not be explained, things that went beyond logic and reason. The spirits, the lost souls that had been trapped in the Cloverstone for decades, had made themselves known, and Richard Cloverstone's voice, once a whisper in the dark, had become a desperate plea. The curse was real, and Ethan was the only one who could break it. But the question that gnawed at his mind was whether he was willing to pay the price. Ethan had spent hours going over the journal, his hands shaking as he reread Richard's words over and over again. The same message echoed through the pages. The curse will never end unless someone sacrifices themselves to break it. One must give up their life force to free the souls trapped here. Only then can the hotel's torment end. At first, Ethan had dismissed the notion as another one of Richard's delusions. But as he stood in the hallway now, the words seemed more real than ever. The hotel was alive, and it wasn't just haunted. It was a prison for those trapped by a pact made long ago. The spirits were trapped here, and the only way to free them was through a sacrifice. He had seen the figure, the ghost of Richard, walking through the halls like a shadow, seeking redemption for a mistake that had damned him for eternity. And now, the spirits were crying out for release, for someone to make the ultimate sacrifice and give up their life to set them free. But Ethan wasn't ready to die. He wasn't ready to face the decision that loomed before him. The hotel's oppressive silence was broken only by the distant creaking of the old wooden floors, the sound of the building settling around him. He reached the end of the hallway, his flashlight beam flickering against the cracked wallpaper, casting eerie shadows on the walls. He stopped in front of the door, the same door that led to the room where Richard's journal had been found, the room where Ethan had first learned about the curse. The figure had appeared here, standing just beyond the threshold, beckoning Ethan to follow. And now, standing in front of the door once more, he could feel the presence of the spirits, their energy vibrating in the air like a constant hum. The room beyond was dark, but the shadows seemed to move, alive with the restless energy of those who had died and remained behind. Ethan opened the door, his hand trembling as he pushed it inward. The room was just as it had been when he first found the journal, the air cold and heavy. The walls seemed to pulse with an energy he couldn't explain, and the scent of old wood and decay filled the air. He stepped inside, his flashlight flicking over the room as he scanned it for anything new. But there was nothing. Just the same eerie emptiness, the same feeling of being watched. His footsteps echoed in the stillness as he made his way toward the far wall. The journal sat there, just as he had left it, its pages still filled with Richard's frantic writing. Ethan picked it up again, his fingers brushing against the worn leather cover. He opened it to the last page, the words still fresh in his mind. May 25, 1922. I have seen the end. It is coming for me. I cannot escape it. The spirits have claimed me, and I am their price. I have tried to undo the pact, but I cannot. I am bound to this place, bound to this hotel. The spirits have come for me, and I will sacrifice myself to free them. My soul will be the key. My life will be the cost. I have no choice. It is the only way to lift the curse. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he read Richard's final words. The weight of the decision that Richard had made, the sacrifice he had offered, hung in the air. Richard had given up his life to break the curse, to free the trapped souls. And now it was Ethan's turn to decide whether he would follow the same path. The whispers grew louder again, as if the spirits were urging him forward. He could hear them now, their voices seeping into his consciousness, urging him to make the sacrifice, to end the torment once and for all. But could he really do it? Could he give up his own life to end the curse? Ethan. The voices were growing clearer now, calling his name. He turned toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure of Richard appeared in the doorway, standing tall and imposing, his face still hidden in shadow. Ethan. Richard's voice was soft, filled with both sorrow and longing. You have the power to free them, but it will cost you. Ethan's throat was dry as he looked at the figure, his mind spinning. He knew what he had to do. He knew that the only way to break the curse was to make the ultimate sacrifice. But the thought of giving up his life, of dying in this cursed hotel, filled him with an overwhelming sense of dread. I don't want to die. Ethan's voice cracked as he spoke, the fear choking him. I can't do this. I can't. Richard's figure flickered, his expression softening with empathy. You don't have to, but if you don't, the curse will never end. The spirits will never be free, and you will never leave. Ethan closed his eyes, the weight of the decision crashing down on him. He had always lived his life by logic, by reason. But now, faced with the impossible choice, he realized that logic had no place here. This wasn't about reason. It was about sacrifice, about making a choice that transcended everything he had ever believed. The figure stepped closer, his voice softening. There is another way. Ethan opened his eyes, his heart hammering in his chest. What? Richard's voice was almost a whisper now. You don't have to give your life. His face softened, his eyes filled with sadness. You can give your soul, your life force. The hotel doesn't need your body, Ethan. It needs your essence. The price must be paid, but it doesn't have to be your life. Ethan's mind raced as the weight of Richard's words sank in. He didn't have to die. He didn't have to lose himself to the curse. He could still save the spirits, still break the pact, but at what cost? The voices in the room grew louder, pleading, urging him to make the choice. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a physical force, and he could feel himself slipping, his mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what was at stake. He glanced at the journal again, reading the last of Richard's words. He could feel it now, the darkness that clung to the hotel, the spirits trapped in a cycle they could never escape from. It wasn't just about breaking the curse anymore. It was about freeing them, giving them the peace they had been denied for so long. Ethan closed his eyes again, his breath steadying as he made his decision. He could sacrifice his soul, his life force, to free the spirits. He could break the curse and set them all free. It was the only way to put an end to this. And as the whispers reached their peak, Ethan knew he had made the right choice. He stepped forward, the hotel's oppressive weight lifting from his shoulders as the spirit of Richard Cloverstone nodded in approval. "Thank you, Ethan." And as Ethan felt his life force begin to slip away, he knew he had given everything for something greater than himself. Ethan stood in the center of the room, his body trembling from the weight of the decision he had just made. The sacrifice wasn't easy, and the fear of what was about to happen still gnawed at the edges of his mind. But he knew that there was no turning back now. His soul, his life force, it would be the key to breaking the curse, the key to setting the spirits trapped in the Cloverstone free. Everything had led to this moment. The whispers, the shadows, the haunting presence of Richard Cloverstone, it all pointed to one thing. Ethan was the one who could end the torment of the hotel's restless spirits. But the cost was his. He could feel it deep in his chest, the slow realization that by invoking the ritual, he would not leave the hotel the same man he had been when he entered. His hands were cold, the journal still clenched in his grip. The pages were wrinkled and torn, the ink fading with each passing moment. He had read the ritual, Richard's desperate words, over and over again, trying to prepare himself for what he was about to do. But nothing could have prepared him for the weight of the power he was about to summon, the dark energy that had been bound to the hotel for decades. He had chosen to give his soul instead of his life, but the forces he was about to unleash were still dangerous. They were unpredictable. The spirits would not let him go easily. Ethan took a deep breath and began to walk to the far end of the room where the altar Richard had once used stood. It was a makeshift structure, simple but meaningful, faded candles placed around a tarnished silver bowl. The altar, unlike the rest of the room, hadn't aged much, as if time had forgotten it. Ethan knew what he had to do. From the journal, he had learned the steps of the ritual. It was a dangerous, complicated act, and he could feel the weight of it now, its power pulsing in the air, thick with history and pain. The ritual was long and filled with chaos, designed to break the pact Richard had made with the spirits. But it came with a warning. Those who invoked it could be consumed by the same spirits, their souls bound forever to the hotel if the ritual was interrupted or failed. Ethan clenched his fists, his heart pounding. He didn't have a choice. He had made his decision. The spirits would be free, and the curse would end, no matter what it cost him. Ethan took the journal and opened it to the page detailing the ritual. The first part was simple, but it required an offering, a gesture to acknowledge the power he was about to invoke. He placed his hand on the silver bowl and spoke the words aloud, as Richard had written. "Spirits of the Cloverstone, hear my call. I offer my life force, my essence, to break the chains that bind you." The air grew colder, and Ethan could hear the whispers grow louder, swirling around him like a dark wind. His heart raced. He took a deep breath and placed his offering, a drop of his blood, into the bowl, the ritual requiring that he give of himself. The moment his blood touched the bowl, the temperature in the room plummeted. The candles flickered wildly, their flames wavering as though they were being buffeted by an unseen wind. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, as if the hotel itself was waking up. The ground beneath his feet trembled. Ethan clenched his jaw, trying to stay steady as he moved to the next part of the ritual. He had to follow the steps, each one carefully outlined in Richard's journal. "I call upon the spirits trapped within these walls. I invoke your presence to break the curse of the Cloverstone." The room seemed to shift as he spoke the words. The shadows around him grew thicker, swirling in the corners, moving like living things. Ethan could feel them, the spirits pressing in, their energy coalescing around him, filling the room with an overwhelming force. They were alive, their desperation palpable in the air. "Release yourselves." Ethan's voice trembled, but he kept going. "Leave this hotel, leave this land, the curse is broken." The ground trembled again, this time violently. The air thickened, as if the walls of the hotel themselves were straining against the ritual. Ethan could hear the screams of the spirits echoing through the hallways, each one desperate for release, for freedom from the curse that had bound them for so long. The temperature dropped further until Ethan could see his breath in the air, thick and frosty. His hands trembled, but he couldn't stop now. He was too deep in the ritual, too far to turn back. He could feel his life force slipping from him, his energy being drained as though the spirits were feeding off of him, taking what they needed to break the curse. Suddenly, the walls around him shifted. The shadows in the room grew stronger, almost tangible, until Ethan felt them pressing against him, their coldness seeping into his skin. He could hear the voice again, the same voice that had haunted him since he entered the Cloverstone. Richard Cloverstone's ghost. "Ethan, you must finish it, you must give everything." The voice was low, urgent, and filled with a quiet desperation. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps as the dark energy built around him. The shadows seemed to twist, growing more intense. He could feel his own strength waning, his energy flickering, like a candle about to be snuffed out. He had no choice but to push forward. He had to finish the ritual no matter what. The spirits had to be freed, and if it meant he had to give everything to do it, then he would. With a final, resolute breath, Ethan recited the last part of the ritual. "By my soul, by my life force, I free you. The curse is lifted. The pact is broken. The spirits are free." The room exploded in an eruption of energy, the force of it shattering the walls around him. The temperature dropped to impossible levels, and the shadows writhed in agony, swirling and twisting like a storm. Ethan screamed, his voice swallowed by the chaos around him. His body shook as his life force seemed to pour out of him, the ritual draining everything he had left. But then, just as suddenly as the chaos had begun, it stopped. The room fell silent. The air grew still, and the oppressive weight that had filled the space lifted. Ethan could barely stand, his legs weak beneath him. The world around him seemed to spin, his vision blurring as if he were about to pass out. But he had done it. The curse was broken. The shadows were gone. The whispers had ceased. The spirits were free. Ethan staggered back, collapsing to the floor as his body gave out, the last of his energy fading. The journal, still clenched tightly in his hands, slipped from his fingers and fell to the floor with a soft thud. As his consciousness began to fade, he heard one last whisper, a soft, gratifying sigh. "Thank you." The morning light seeped through the cracks in the heavy curtains, casting long, golden beams across the room. The once oppressive weight that had hung in the air for so long, the dark presence of the hotel's curse, had lifted. The Cloverstone, the place that had been a prison for so many lost souls, was now quiet, eerily so. The whispers that had once filled the hallways had vanished. The oppressive shadows that had danced across the walls no longer seemed to follow him. The air felt lighter, more breathable, as if the hotel had exhaled, finally freed from the forces that had bound it for decades. Ethan sat in the center of the room, the journal still lying open beside him, its pages now devoid of the frantic scribbles that had once filled it. The ritual had been completed. The curse was broken. But the question that remained in his mind was one that had been gnawing at him for hours. What now? The last remnants of the ritual still clung to him, the weight of the sacrifice he had made still fresh in his bones. He could feel the drain of the ritual in his very essence. His soul had been the price paid for the freedom of the spirits. He had given a part of himself to lift the curse, to allow the lost souls of the Cloverstone to finally move on, to escape the cycle of torment that had held them captive for so long. But at what cost? The hotel, once a dark and haunted place, had undergone its own transformation. The air felt different, clearer, cleaner, as if it had been washed of the malevolent energy that had poisoned it. The dark corners that had once been filled with shadows now seemed to be filled with light. The walls that had creaked with secrets were now silent, the oppressive weight of history no longer pressing against the building's fragile frame. Ethan stood, his legs unsteady, his body aching with exhaustion. The past few days felt like a dream. No, a nightmare, one that he could never truly escape. His body still felt like it had been drained of all its strength, but there was something else now, a strange calm. The sense of peace that filled the air was palpable, and yet something inside him had changed. He had sacrificed a part of himself to break the curse, and though the spirits were free, there was a void now, a space left inside of him that would never be filled. Ethan's fingers brushed against the edge of the journal, and he picked it up again, thumbing through the pages. He had read it so many times now, trying to make sense of everything Richard had written. The final entry, the one that had filled him with so much dread and fear, was now just another part of the hotel's tragic history, one that would eventually be forgotten. The spirits were free. Richard's pact was broken, and the hotel had been purged of its malevolent energy. But the hotel had also taken something from Ethan. The man who had walked into the Cloverstone a few weeks ago was no longer the same. The skeptic, the man who had dismissed the supernatural and believed only in logic, had changed. He had seen the unimaginable. He had confronted the unexplainable. And in doing so, he had given a part of himself to something far beyond his control. Ethan looked around the room one last time. The Cloverstone was silent, almost peaceful. The damage done by the curse had been undone, but the scars remained. He would never forget the darkness that had consumed the building or the spirits that had haunted it. He would never forget the sacrifice he had made and the faces of those lost souls that had. It was time to go. Ethan had made his choice, and now the hotel was no longer his to protect. The spirits had been set free. The curse was broken. The past could no longer control him, nor could it control the hotel. Ethan walked down the long corridor one last time, his footsteps echoing in the silence. There was no longer any flicker of light in the corners, no ominous whisper in the air. The hallways felt empty now, void of the malevolent presence that had haunted them for so long. As he stepped out of the hotel, the sun greeted him, the light warm and welcoming. The wind carried the scent of fresh air, the breeze moving through the trees outside. It was the first time in days that Ethan had felt truly alive, as if the weight of everything, the spirits, the ritual, the curse, had been lifted from his shoulders. But as he stood there on the hotel steps, looking back at the Cloverstone, a part of him couldn't help but feel like he was leaving behind a piece of himself. The man who had walked into the hotel just weeks ago, skeptical, unafraid, was gone. In his place stood someone who had seen the truth, someone who had stared death in the face and lived to tell the tale. But living was no longer enough. He had broken the curse, but the price he had paid would stay with him for the rest of his life. The hotel loomed behind him, dark and imposing, yet strangely peaceful. It had been a prison, a tomb for the spirits that had once been trapped inside, but now it was a place of freedom. The ghosts were gone, their torment ended. The hotel's walls, once filled with shadows and despair, now stood silent, no longer haunted by the past, but rather freed from it. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of it all, the burden of what he had done. He wasn't sure what the future held for him now. The world outside the Cloverstone was vast and uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't stay here. The hotel had taken enough from him. It was time to move on. As Ethan walked away from the hotel, the silence of the morning settled over him. The winds carried away the last of his fear, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan felt at peace, not with the hotel but with himself. He had faced the impossible. He had broken the curse. The weight on his shoulders had been lifted. The spirits were free, and Ethan was free to live again.